My son called me on a Tuesday morning. Dad, I sold your lake house. You have until Saturday to get out. I held the phone looking out over the quiet water and simply replied, You forgot one thing. He scoffed and asked, What are you talking about? What came out of me wasn't really laughter. It was something colder, darker. Because the property he'd just handed off to some cutthroat corporate developer wasn't the lake house at all. It was the adjacent condemned parcel next door, the one sitting under a $500,000 federal environmental cleanup lie-in. The name's Everett, 70 years old. My whole life I held to one belief: pour everything into your children, and they'll grow up knowing how to give. 30 years, I worked as a commercial real estate auditor, methodical and steady, assembling a modest life I was proud of. The lake house, Lake Lanier, Georgia, was the crown of it, the retreat my late wife Lorraine and I had chosen as the place we'd spend our final years. That particular afternoon, I was down at the dock, my hands covered in grease, as I patched the hull of the old aluminum fishing boat, when the sound of tires grinding over gravel pulled my attention up. Preston's car, and beside him, Natasha. Neither one of them lifted a hand to wave. Welcome back to Alpha Dad Stories. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into it, I'd love to know what you're up to right now while you're listening. Are you out on a drive, maybe puttering around the kitchen, or just sitting somewhere quiet, trying to get a little peace? Drop it in the comments. It always means a lot to hear from you. Now, a quick note before we begin: some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. Neither of them bothered to come down to the dock. Instead, Natasha marched straight up to the porch, pulled a tape measure from her designer tote bag, and started measuring the living room windows through the screen door. I wiped my hands on a rag and climbed the hill. Preston was leaning against his car, his least expensive luxury car eyes down on his phone. He didn't ask how my heart was holding up, didn't ask how I was sleeping. He just glanced up and said, Dad, I need you to float me another $20,000. My tech venture is hitting a snag. I stopped on the bottom step of the porch. I looked at the man I had raised, the man whose college tuition first car and the down payment on his home I had paid for all in cash. I shook my head. No. I reminded him that just last year I had already handed over $100,000 money that disappeared without a trace. Preston crossed his arms, face going ugly with a sneer. Standing there on property I'd spent decades of hard work to earn, he called me a freeloader. Said I was just an old man occupying space, contributing nothing while he was out grinding away. Natasha hollered from the porch that the antique oak bookshelves would need to be smashed apart to open the layout up. They weren't looking at a father. They were looking at an asset they wanted to cash out. I didn't raise my voice. I learned that a long time ago, the moment you start shouting, you've surrendered your leverage. I told them I was going out for a walk and left them there in the driveway. When I came back an hour later, a rented commercial dumpster had been dropped beside the garage. Natasha was dragging heavy cardboard boxes out of the house and pitching them in. I recognized the handwriting on the sides. Lorraine's things, my wife's favorite books, her old gardening tools, the knitted blankets she'd spent her last winters making. I walked over and started quietly pulling the boxes back out. I brushed the grime off a photo album and held it against my chest. Natasha rolled her eyes so hard she nearly lost her footing. She turned to Preston and groaned. He is losing his grip on reality. Preston hanging onto this junk is a sign of serious cognitive decline. We need to step in before he does something to hurt himself. They left not long after, and I stood alone in the settling dust of their taillights. That night, sitting in the silent living room, I could see what they were constructing. They were painting me as a senile old man who could no longer manage his own affairs. I had to find out exactly what they were scheming. I dug out a small voice-activated recorder I'd used back in my auditing days for dictating notes, and I tucked it behind those heavy oak bookshelves Natasha was so hungry to demolish. Next time they came to measure the place, I made sure I was out on the water. Late that night, I sat at the kitchen table, the only light the moon's reflection sliding across the lake. I pressed play. For a moment, there was just the click of Natasha's heels on the hardwood. Then Preston's voice came through the speaker, and he sounded desperate, cornered. He told Natasha that private lenders were going to break his legs if he didn't produce $300,000 before the month was out. He'd borrowed from dangerous men to bankroll a life he couldn't actually afford. Natasha didn't flinch. Her voice was flat and precise. She brought up the medical power of attorney I'd signed 2 years earlier. I'd suffered a mild stroke around that time, a scare nothing more but enough to make me think ahead. I had given Preston the legal authority to make medical calls if I ever wound up in a hospital bed. On that recording, Natasha laid out the scheme step by step. They would forge a modification to that document, converting it into a general financial power of attorney. She had already been in contact with a ruthless corporate developer called Apex Developments, notorious for snapping up prime lakefront property in cash, tearing down whatever stood there, and throwing up high-rise condos in its place. Apex was offering $800,000 for the estate Lake Lanier, Georgia. Preston hesitated for just a sliver of a second, asking what would become of me. Natasha laughed. They'd park me in a state-run nursing home and use the remaining $500,000 to finally live the way they believed they deserved. My own blood. Planning to sell the ground beneath my feet and bury me away to settle his debts. I didn't sleep that night. Not one tear. The boy I'd raised was gone, hollowed out, and replaced by something that would burn me down to save itself. Come morning, I drove into town. Not to the police, to the office of Gerald Fitch, downtown Gainesville, Georgia. My attorney and the oldest friend I had. I sat in his leather chair and let the recording run. Gerald's face went pale. He typed hard and fast, pulling up the county clerk's database. He looked at me with grim eyes and confirmed it. Preston had already filed the fraudulent financial power of attorney. The deed transfer to Apex Developments was pending. Gerald reached for his phone and said he could file an emergency injunction to freeze the transaction immediately and have Preston arrested for forgery. I leaned across the desk and pressed his hand down gently. I told him no. I wanted Preston to go through with the sale. Gerald looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd just said something alarming. But then I walked him back to a quiet deal we'd handled 15 years ago. I had bought the abandoned mill parcel adjacent tract Lake Lanier, Georgia, that sat next to the estate for almost nothing, purely to block a chemical company from moving in near my home. That parcel was legally condemned. The soil was poisoned, and it carried a federal Environmental Protection Agency cleanup mandate of $500,000. That federal lien was attached strictly to whoever held the title. I leaned in and laid out the plan. We were going to execute a precise, aggressive legal maneuver. We would replat the land registries, adjust the property boundaries tied to the title Preston was using for the sale. I would let my son sell the land. But the deed he handed Apex Developments would explicitly describe the coordinates of the toxic, condemned swamp, not my pristine estate. We worked through the rest of that day drafting the trap. I was going to give my son exactly what he thought he wanted. 3 days went by in total silence. I spent my mornings on the porch watching the mist lift off the lake. It was a Thursday afternoon when a heavy black vehicle tore down my gravel driveway. It didn't slow for the bends. It threw up a rooster tail of dirt and stopped inches from my flower beds. A man in a tight gray suit climbed out carrying a thick leather clipboard wearing the kind of smug smile that belongs to a person who's never once been told no. He didn't knock. He pounded on the glass screen. I set my coffee cup down and pulled the door open. He skipped introductions. He looked at his watch, sighed loudly, and pushed past me into my own home. He said his name was Garrett, an independent appraiser. He swept his gaze around the living room with barely concealed contempt, scribbling on his clipboard. He told me the new owners had sent him to evaluate the property before demolition. He never once made eye contact. He talked to me the way you'd talk to a child who couldn't hear slow and loud. Asked whether the movers had given me a schedule. Told me I needed bags packed by the weekend because the bulldozers were already booked. My son had sent a stranger into my home to treat me like a squatter who'd run out his welcome. A familiar cold anger climbed up through my chest, and I pushed it straight back down. I remembered the golden rule of auditing. Never tip off the target before the trap is fully set. I let my shoulders sag. I made my hands tremble just a little. I looked at the floor and shuffled, playing the frail and baffled old man they all believed I was. In a shaky voice, I asked whether he was certain he had the right address. I told him my son Preston usually managed my paperwork because my memory wasn't what it used to be. Garrett gave a short, mean laugh. Muttered that it was pathetic how long people cling to houses they can't afford. Told me the paperwork was ironclad and that I was nothing but a tenant now. I gave a slow nod, wearing my best look of helpless confusion. I asked him if he would like a glass of cold lemonade while he worked. I told him it was very hot outside and that I was just about to pour a pitcher. Garrett rolled his eye, but arrogance made him sloppy. He said yes, barked for extra ice, and dropped his heavy leather clipboard onto my kitchen counter before wandering off down the hallway to inspect the wiring. The instant his back was turned, the trembling stopped. My spine straightened. I moved with the quiet, practiced economy of a man who'd spent 3 decades pulling corporate fraud out of the shadows. I crossed to the counter and flipped the clipboard open. Dozens of pages, legal contracts, property assessments, escrow agreements. My son had put his name on every dotted line, transferring the full legal liability of the sale squarely onto himself. I slipped my phone from my pocket without making a sound. Clear, high-resolution photographs of every visible page. I captured the buyer signatures. I captured the transfer coordinates. I captured the penalty clauses buried deep in the fine print. It was a masterclass in corporate predation. Garrett hollered from the hallway about the old wiring in the ceiling. I called back in my quavering, uncertain voice that I was just wrestling the ice tray out of the freezer. I turned to the final page and my gaze landed on the buyer entity, not a generic real estate firm. Apex Developments. A cold smile moved across my face. I knew Apex Developments well from my years on the auditing floor. Notorious operators, bottom feeders, and tailored suits. They didn't simply purchase land. They deliberately hunted vulnerable sellers, locked them into airtight contracts, and then unleashed armies of corporate lawyers the moment a title showed. Even a hairline flaw or a closing ran a day late. Any discrepancy, however small, and Apex would move to strip the seller of every personal asset they owned as compensation. Preston thought he was selling my home to a standard developer to clear the hidden debts he owed to dangerous private lenders. He had no idea he'd just stepped inside a cage with something that hadn't eaten in a week. By signing that contract as primary seller, my son had bound himself legally to Apex's lethal penalty clauses. He was guaranteeing them a clean, buildable lakefront estate. But through the quiet legal maneuver Gerald and I had already executed, the title Preston was obligated to deliver wasn't my home. It was the toxic, condemned swamp sitting next door. I heard Garrett's footsteps coming back up the hall. I eased the clipboard shut, pocketed my phone, and picked up a glass of cold lemonade. The trembling came back right on cue. Garrett plucked the glass from my hand without a word of thanks, took a long swallow, grabbed his clipboard, and said he'd seen all he needed to see. He told me the property was a teardown regardless. He fixed me with flat, empty eyes and said I'd better be clear of the premises before Saturday morning, because Apex had no patience for delays. He walked out the front door and left a cloud of dust drifting over my flower beds. I stood in the kitchen and pulled a long, slow breath. My son had sent a predator to swallow me whole, and had no idea I just redirected that hunger straight back at him. The trap was fully set. The predator was already moving, and all that remained was for me to step out of the way. I pulled my truck off the road behind a worn-out diner sitting right on the Hall-Forsyth County line. The neon sign overhead buzzed and flickered. I went inside and took the booth at the very back. Drummond was already there, waiting. He was a private investigator I'd relied on repeatedly throughout my working years, sharp, discreet, and not given to unnecessary conversation. He didn't greet me when I sat down. He simply pushed a thick manila folder across the sticky tabletop. He told me he'd dug through everything I'd asked for and then some. He dropped his eyes to his coffee and said that in all his years he'd witnessed plenty of corporate theft, but this file was the ugliest thing he'd ever assembled. I thanked him and drew the folder toward me. My son had always written me off as a simple man. Preston watched me sand wood on the porch and tinker with boat engines, and decided I was just a retired laborer marking time until I faded into nothing. He'd completely lost sight of what actually built the lake house, Lake Lanier, Georgia, in the first place. He'd forgotten that for 30 years I'd been a senior commercial real estate auditor. I didn't just read contracts. I took them apart stitch by stitch. My entire career was built on tracking down corporate embezzlers, chasing hidden offshore accounts, and dismantling sophisticated property fraud, county zoning codes, escrow loopholes, title chain regulations. I understood them more deeply than the lawyers who drafted them. I earned a very good living destroying confident men in expensive suits who believed they were smarter than the system. Preston thought he could play a shell game with my property. He didn't grasp that he was trying to con the person who wrote the playbook. I opened the folder. The first pages were exactly what Gerald and I had expected. Drummond had secured certified copies of the fraudulent power of attorney. Preston had forged my signature cleanly. He'd hired a corrupt notary to stamp the document, handing himself total authority over my physical assets. Behind that sat the pending sale agreement with Apex Developments, all of it laid out in black and white. But as I worked deeper into the dossier, the nature of the documents shifted. These weren't property records anymore. They were bank statements. They were credit reports, page after page of high-interest financial accounts I had never seen in my life. I stared at a platinum credit card statement, maxed out at $35,000. The billing address was Preston's luxury apartment, Buckhead, Atlanta, but the name on the account was mine. I turned the page, a second card maxed at $20,000, then a third, then an unsecured personal line of credit. I scanned the application documents Drummond had pulled. Preston hadn't just forged my signature to move the lake house, Lake Lanier, Georgia. He had stolen my social security number, the 9 digits I'd used to construct my entire life. The same 9 digits I'd used to open his first college savings account had been turned against me to commit wholesale identity theft. I worked through the itemized charges on the stolen cards. The depth of it was staggering. Preston had used my stolen identity to fund the entire facade of his affluence. My name paid for the expensive dinners he and Natasha enjoyed while mapping out my eviction. My credit leased the luxury car he drove to my property the day he called me a freeloader. And then I reached the charges from the past 2 weeks, the ones that drained the warmth from my blood entirely. Preston had used my stolen credit cards to pay for the commercial dumpsters that carted away my late wife's belongings. He had used my name to pay the arrogant appraiser who'd shoved past me in my own doorway. My son was financing my destruction with my own stolen identity. I sat in that booth for a long time. The coffee in front of me went cold without my noticing. I did not feel anger. Anger runs hot. It belongs to people you still have feeling for. Anger means you want the other person to comprehend the wound they've caused, to apologize, to give you back something. I wanted none of that. What I felt was vast and glacial, an emptiness that stretched in every direction. I looked at the signature on the fraudulent credit applications. I thought of the morning Preston was born, the weight of him in my arms. I thought of the 80-hour weeks I'd logged auditing corrupt firms so he could walk out of a private university without owing a single dollar in student loans. Every advantage a father could give, I gave it. And he had reduced my entire existence to a stolen social security number and a forged name on a dotted line. There, in that quiet diner at the Hall-Forsyth County line, with the smell of burnt coffee and stale grease settling around me, the last thread gave way. The boy I raised was gone. He'd likely been gone for years, quietly replaced by something hollow and consuming, willing to feed on its own father to keep itself alive. The man who had stuffed my late wife's things into trash bags was not my son. He was a catastrophic liability. And 30 years of auditing had given me a very precise understanding of how to handle a catastrophic liability. You don't negotiate with it. You don't appeal to it. You liquidate it completely and without hesitation. I closed the folder and slid it into my briefcase. I passed Drummond an envelope of cash for his work. He told me to watch myself, warning that people drowning in debt will do desperate, dangerous things when the walls close in. I looked him straight in the eye and said I wasn't the one with my back against the wall. I walked out of that diner and climbed into my truck. The sky hung heavy and gray, thick with the promise of rain. I drove back toward the lake house with my mind sharp and my conscience clear. The illusion of family was gone. Blood meant nothing to me anymore. My son had crossed fully from a disappointment into an enemy. Preston believed he had the upper hand because he'd stolen my identity and sold off my land. He figured he'd outmaneuvered a naive old man with sawdust on his hands. What he didn't know was that every single move he'd made was feeding directly into the legal trap I'd already buried deep in the county registry. He was burning stolen money he'd never be able to repay. He was making guarantees to a corporate predator he'd never be able to honor. I rolled down that winding road toward the lake, carrying a profound stillness inside me. I was no longer a father trying to save a wayward boy. I was the architect of his absolute ruin. And I intended to watch every last piece of his world come apart. The morning sun climbed above the water, throwing long, sharp shadows across the weathered planks of my back porch. The lake sat completely motionless. Not one ripple crossed the surface. I sat in my favorite wooden porch chair, holding a mug of black coffee, watching the light inch its way across the property I'd bought with decades of brutal, unrelenting labor. The air was cool and clean, carrying pine and damp earth on the breeze. It was the kind of hushed, perfect morning my late wife Lorraine used to treasure. I drank my coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle deep into my chest. There was a profound solitude in that moment, but the ache of loneliness was gone. What replaced it was the cold, deliberate stillness of a sniper settled into his blind. I knew precisely what day it was. I knew exactly what was unfolding in the city miles away. The escrow accounts were clearing. The fraudulent paperwork was moving through the county clerk offices. My son was snapping his trap shut, completely blind to the fact that he was already standing inside mine. The phone resting on the small wooden table beside my chair started to vibrate. That sharp, mechanical buzzing tore through the silence of the lake like a blade. I didn't jump. I didn't flinch. I turned my head slowly and looked at the glowing screen. The name Preston flashed in bright white letters. I let it ring. I let it rattle against the wood for a good long while, watching the screen throw light across the dark grain of the table. I took another slow sip of coffee, holding the bitterness on my tongue. I needed to let him sweat for a few seconds. I needed him to feel the false power of the moment he thought he was about to own. When the phone hit its fourth ring, I reached over and picked it up. I pressed the green button and raised it to my ear. I didn't say hello. I didn't offer a single word. I just breathed into the receiver and waited for the parasite to speak. Preston skipped the pleasantries entirely. He didn't ask how I was or what I was up to. His voice came through the line, sharp, cold, saturated with an arrogance that barely concealed his desperation. "Dad, I've sold your lake house. You have until Saturday to get out." He delivered the words, fast, working to sound like a hard-edged executive executing a hostile takeover. He wanted to come across as commanding, but I caught the faint tremor of adrenaline threading through his breath. He had just received the wire transfer from Apex Developments. He had just used my stolen identity to pay off the violent men he owed money to. He was riding the euphoric high of a man who believes he has pulled off the perfect crime. I didn't interrupt him. I held the phone to my ear, gazing out at the still water, my own blood running at absolute zero. In the background, the clinking of expensive glassware drifted through the line. They were at a restaurant. They were celebrating. Then a sharp, familiar voice cut through the noise behind him. It was Natasha. Her tone was loud, deliberately pitched, so I'd be sure to catch it through the receiver. "Tell them to bring extra heavy-duty trash bags." A shrill, venomous laugh followed. "We need the movers to pack up all the old man's junk and haul it to the dump. I don't want any of his garbage stinking up the place before the demolition crew gets there." Preston cleared his throat, angling to take back control of the conversation. "Did you hear me, Dad? The deal is closed. The paperwork is finalized. I've arranged for a state facility to take you in Monday morning. They specialize in memory care. It's for your own good. You're clearly not well, and Natasha and I simply can't be burdened with managing your decline. Have your bags packed and be off the property by Saturday morning. The buyers are ruthless, and they want the land cleared immediately." I listened to every lie pouring from my son's mouth. I listened to him dress up theft, fraud, and ultimate betrayal as concern for my well-being. He was trying to gaslight me into accepting my own destruction. He truly believed I was a senile, helpless old carpenter. He had completely forgotten the man who had spent 30 years dismantling corporate empires from the inside out. He had forgotten the auditor who could sniff out a hidden liability buried inside 1,000 pages of dense legal jargon. My son was proudly clutching the pin of a grenade he had just pulled, entirely unaware he was standing on a landmine holding a forged deed to a toxic, federally condemned swamp. He waited for my response. He expected me to scream. He expected tears pleading desperate questions about how he could do this to his own father. He wanted that raw, emotional reaction to confirm his power over me. He wanted to hear the devastation crack through my voice, so he could end the call and laugh with his wife about how easily they'd taken down the old man. I gave him nothing. I denied him the closure of my grief. I took one last look at the solid, beautiful house I had raised with my own 2 hands. The dock, the boat, the old oak trees, throwing shade across the porch. Then I spoke into the receiver. My voice was completely flat, not a trace of anger, sorrow, or fear in it. I said one sentence, and nothing more. I will be gone. Before Preston could get another word out, before he could settle into his false victory, I pulled the phone from my ear and cut the call. I set the phone face down on the wooden table. The silence flooded back in, filling the porch, spreading across the yard, swallowing the whole world around me. The conversation was finished. The relationship was finished. The blood tie was cut permanently. I had just handed my son the rope he would hang himself with. I got up from the chair. No rush. I pushed through the screen door and walked into the living room. The house felt different now. It wasn't a home any longer. It was a perfectly baited trap. I passed the antique oak bookshelves Natasha had wanted to demolish with a sledgehammer. I passed the stone fireplace that Lorraine and I had designed together. I walked into the master bedroom and opened the closet. I didn't pull out moving boxes. I didn't reach for heavy luggage. I pulled down a single worn canvas duffel bag. I packed 4 changes of clothes. I packed my shaving kit. I opened the small safe bolted to the closet floor and took out my true passport, my actual financial ledgers, and the certified county plat Gerald Fitch and I had quietly registered. I laid them carefully at the bottom of the bag. From the nightstand, I lifted a small velvet box holding Lorraine's wedding ring. I slipped it into my breast pocket. That was all. I didn't take the television. I didn't take the tools from my workshop. I didn't take the antique and furniture. I left the house exactly as it had always looked. I left it looking like the comfortable, valuable estate Apex Developments believed they had just purchased. I zipped the canvas duffel bag shut. The sound was loud in the empty room. I swung the strap over my shoulder and walked back down the hallway. I paused in the kitchen. I washed my coffee mug, dried it with a dish towel, and set it back neatly in the cupboard. I wiped the counter clean. I wanted the place to be spotless for the storm that was coming. I walked to the front door, stepped out onto the porch, and pulled the heavy oak door closed behind me. The lock clicked home with a solid metallic thud. I walked down the gravel drive toward my truck. I didn't look back at the house. Not once. Not a flicker of nostalgia, not a trace of regret. My son thought he'd thrown out a helpless old man. He thought he'd cleared the board and claimed the win. What he failed to grasp was that by ordering me off that property, he had just removed the only person who could have warned him about the catastrophic federal lien he had legally assumed the moment that deed transferred. I tossed the duffel bag onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. I turned the key, and the engine came to life beneath me. Preston and Natasha had until Saturday to bask in their stolen fortune. 3 days to pour expensive champagne, drive their leased luxury cars, and toast each other over the old man they'd fed to the wolves. Let them celebrate. Let them burn through the money. Let them feel untouchable. I eased the truck into gear and rolled slowly up the winding dirt road toward the highway. I was leaving the battlefield, pulling back to higher ground, to watch the wreckage come. I was no longer a father. I was an auditor. And the final accounting was about to begin. The drive into town felt like a quiet passage from the stillness of the lake into the clean, exact world of the law. I pulled into the shaded lot outside Gerald Fitch's law firm downtown Gainesville, Georgia. Gerald and I went back decades. We were cut from the same cloth men who understood that real power doesn't announce itself with a loud voice or an expensive car. Real power lives in the fine print. It lives in the silent, unmoving architecture of contracts, deeds, and federal regulations. I walked through the glass doors and past the receptionist with a familiar nod. Gerald was already in his private conference room waiting for me. The heavy mahogany door clicked closed behind me and sealed the room in complete confidentiality. Old paper and leather hung in the air. It was a space built for deliberate, calculated decisions. Gerald sat at the head of a long table, one manila folder resting perfectly in the center of it. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He offered no sympathy about my son. He simply looked at me with a face of professional gravity and gave a single nod. He knew the phone call had come and gone. He knew the fraudulent wire transfer had cleared. He slid the folder across the polished mahogany surface toward me. I settled into the chair opposite him and rested my hands on the cool wood. I didn't open it right away. I didn't need to. I already knew every page inside it. It was the culmination of a ghost trap we had built a month earlier, a snare engineered specifically for a predator too arrogant to glance down before taking his next step. To grasp just how complete that trap was, you have to understand the history of the land surrounding my home. 15 years ago, long before Preston was drowning in debt, and long before my late wife Lorraine passed away, our quiet life on the lake was threatened by a corporate nightmare. A mid-sized chemical manufacturing company tried to purchase a massive abandoned tract of land sitting directly adjacent to my estate. The locals called it the Old Mill Parcel Adjacent Tract, Lake Lanier, Georgia. For decades, it had served as a dumping ground for an old industrial operation, a dead zone of poisoned soil and stagnant chemical runoff. The company wanted to buy it, pave it over, and plant a distribution hub right at the edge of the water. Lorraine was devastated at the thought of industrial trucks tearing apart the piece we'd built there. I didn't bother with city council meetings or protest signs. I used what I actually knew. I stepped in as a commercial real estate auditor and quietly purchased the mill parcel out from under the chemical company through a blind trust. I paid pennies on the dollar because the land was worthless to anyone who intended to use it. It was legally condemned. The soil was saturated so deeply with industrial toxins that nothing could grow there. But owning it let me freeze that company out for good. I protected our home. I protected Lorraine's peace. Owning that parcel, however, came with a monumental hidden liability. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency had surveyed that land, officially designating it a toxic hazard. With that designation came a mandatory, non-negotiable federal cleanup mandate. The EPA had attached a $500,000 environmental lien to the property. Not a suggestion, a hard legal obligation. And the most elegant and terrifying feature of federal environmental law is how it assigns that liability. The EPA doesn't care who poisoned the ground. They don't care who originally ran the mill. The $500,000 cleanup mandate attaches strictly and permanently to whoever holds the current title. The moment your name goes on that deed, you owe the federal government $500,000, and they will freeze your accounts, seize your assets, and garnish your wages until the last penny is recovered. For 15 years, I had kept that toxic parcel safely quarantined under my name, paying the minimal property taxes, maintaining the perimeter fencing, keeping the EPA satisfied while they worked through their long-term remediation schedule. Preston knew I owned the land next door. He just never cared enough to understand what it actually was. He saw acreage. He saw dollar signs. He never read the environmental surveys. He never looked at the liability disclosures. He assumed it was nothing more than a useless extension of my valuable lakefront estate. A month ago, when my hidden audio recorder caught Preston and Natasha plotting to forge my signature and sell my home to Apex Developments, I didn't confront them. Confrontation hands the enemy time to adapt. Instead, I came to Gerald Fitch's office. I sat in this same mahogany conference room, and we executed a precise and invisible restructuring of my assets. Drawing on 30 years of commercial auditing experience, we quietly replatted the land registries with the county clerk. We legally redefined the boundaries and the parcel identification numbers. We shifted the primary address association. We built a labyrinth of paperwork that surgically swapped the legal identities of the two properties. The lake house, Lake Lanier, Georgia, the home I had built with Lorraine, was quietly placed under a newly protected trust, completely insulated from outside transactions. The old toxic mill parcel adjacent tract, Lake Lanier, Georgia, was simultaneously elevated assigned the primary identification numbers Preston had always believed belonged to the estate. We didn't move a single shovel of dirt. We changed the mathematical coordinates that defined that dirt on paper. In commercial real estate, the physical structure means nothing until the ink dries. What matters are the longitude and latitude coordinates, the parcel IDs, and the legal descriptions written into the deed. When Preston slipped into my home office and stole my property records to stage his fraudulent sale, he didn't stop to audit a single page. He didn't bring in an independent surveyor. He was a desperate man running from violent private lenders. He grabbed the top file, copied the parcel identification numbers, and forged my signature onto a transfer of deed. He handed that document to Apex Developments. Apex, blinded by their own greed and the urgency to lock in prime lakefront property at a cut-rate price, bulldozed through the escrow process. They skipped standard environmental due diligence to close the deal fast, planning to strong-arm the seller later if problems surfaced. They relied entirely on the fraudulent paperwork Preston had handed them. I finally opened the manila folder on Gerald's table. I reviewed the certified copies of the closing documents. I read through the final transfer of deed. I traced my finger along the forged signature my son had carefully practiced. Then I moved it up to the property description. And there it was, the exact GPS coordinates and the specific parcel identification number of the old mill parcel adjacent tract, Lake Lanier, Georgia. Preston had not sold my beautiful lake house. He had legally and bindingly sold a federally condemned, deeply toxic swamp to a multi-million-dollar corporate predator. But the true masterpiece of the whole operation was the liability clause. Because Preston had forged my signature, because he had acted as the unauthorized agent of the sale, and because he had officially named himself the primary beneficiary and guarantor of the transaction, in order to secure the wire transfer, he had legally assumed full responsibility for the title. By committing this fraud, my son had unknowingly transferred the $500,000 EPA cleanup mandate directly onto his own back. Gerald leaned back in his leather chair and watched me work through the documents. He let out a slow, measured breath. He told me Apex Developments had already wired $800,000 into the account Preston had opened using my stolen identity. He told me the money had lasted there less than an hour before Preston wired every dollar out to his private lenders to clear his debts. The funds were gone, completely vaporized into the criminal underworld. I closed the folder. The trap had not simply snapped shut. It had locked, sealed, and buried my son alive. Preston was now legally bound by a contract to hand over a pristine estate to Apex Developments, a corporation with a well-earned reputation for suing people into oblivion. Instead, he had handed them a toxic wasteland. The moment Apex realized they had wired $800,000 for a radioactive swamp, they would demand every cent returned. But Preston didn't have the money. He had already burned through it. That meant Apex would unleash their battalion of attorneys to financially strip him of everything he owned. They would come for his apartment, his cars, his wages, and his wife's assets. And while Apex was dismantling him in civil court, the federal government would be circling. The Environmental Protection Agency would issue a federal citation. They would pull up the forged title and find Preston's name on it as the guarantor. They would come after him for their $500,000 in toxic cleanup costs. My son had wedged himself between a corporate meat grinder and a federal firing squad, and he had done it with a smile on his face. Gerald looked across the table at me, studying my expression for any flicker of doubt or regret. He asked me what I wanted to do next. He asked me if I was ready for the fallout. I pushed back from the table and stood. I picked up my leather duffel bag. I felt the familiar weight of Lorraine's wedding ring pressing against my chest from my breast pocket. I looked at my oldest friend and told him there was nothing left to do but watch the clock. I told him we were going to wait for Saturday morning. We were going to let Preston bring his moving trucks and his corporate buyers out to the lake. We were going to let him stand on that porch and savor his victory. And then we were going to hand him the federal plat maps and watch his entire world turn to ash. I walked out of Gerald Fitch's law firm downtown Gainesville, Georgia, and stepped back into the cool morning air. The sky was clear, and everything felt razor-sharp and focused. The illusion of my family was gone, but my will to survive had never felt more solid. I climbed into my truck, turned the key, and headed toward the quiet motel on the edge of town, Gainesville, Georgia, where I would spend the next 2 days. I wasn't hiding. I was simply giving the poison enough time to reach the heart. Atlanta was a completely different world from the quiet shores of the lake. I drove through the thick evening traffic, watching the sky deepen into a bruised, stormy purple. The rain had started coming down just as I crossed the city limits. It was a cold and steady drizzle that slicked the asphalt and made the streetlights bleed into long, smeared streaks of red and gold. I wound through the maze of one-way streets and glass towers until I reached the Buckhead Financial District. I pulled my truck into a shadowed parking space directly across from a restaurant called the Rosewood Grill. It was the kind of place that didn't bother with a large sign out front. Velvet ropes at the entrance, a queue of luxury vehicles waiting on the valet and floor-to-ceiling windows that put the wealthy and those desperate to appear wealthy on full display. I cut the engine. I sat in the dark, quiet cab, listening to the steady percussion of rain against the roof. I didn't have to search for them. They were right there at a prime table in the center of the main dining room, perfectly framed by the big plate glass window. Preston and Natasha sat bathed in the warm golden glow of an expensive chandelier. My son had on a sharp-tailored suit. Natasha wore a shimmering silk dress I was certain she'd bought on my stolen credit card. A waiter in a crisp black vest was standing beside their table, pouring champagne into tall crystal flutes from a bottle wrapped in a white cloth. I watched through the rain-slicked windshield as Preston lifted his glass. He leaned forward over the white tablecloth, and he was smiling. Not the tight, frantic smile of a man drowning under hidden debt. It was wide, loose, and triumphant. The suffocating dread that had been crushing his chest for months had lifted completely. He tapped his crystal flute against Natasha's. She threw her head back and laughed a bright, arrogant declaration of total victory. I sat in the shadows and watched my own flesh and blood toast to my destruction. They were celebrating their cleverness. They were raising their glasses to the fact that they had just made a 70-year-old man homeless. In their heads, the scam had been flawlessly executed. They had forged my signature, sold my sanctuary to a corporate giant, and sent me packing like a discarded piece of trash. They thought I was sitting alone in the dark at the lake house, Lake Lanier, Georgia, right now, sobbing over my packed boxes, terrified of the state-run nursing home they had dangled over me like a threat. They were celebrating their complete absence of conscience. They were drinking expensive champagne paid for by the ruin of the man who had given them everything. 30 years as a commercial real estate auditor had taught me a great deal about human nature. I had sat across the table from embezzlers, con artists, and corrupt executives. There is a very specific psychology to criminals who believe they have just pulled off a massive fraud. They experience a euphoric high. Their brains flood with adrenaline and dopamine. They feel completely invincible. They convince themselves they are smarter than the system, smarter than the law, and infinitely smarter than their victims. I watched Preston cut into a thick steak, gesturing broadly with his hands. He was riding that exact high. He believed he was untouchable. What he didn't understand was that the profound relief washing over him was nothing more than the calm at the center of a hurricane. The back wall of that storm was about to tear his entire world apart. The phone in my coat pocket began to vibrate. That short, sharp buzz broke the silence inside the cab. I reached into my coat and pulled out the device. The screen lit up my face in the dark. It was a secure, encrypted text message from Drummond, my private investigator. Drummond had spent the entire afternoon tracking the digital footprint of the escrow accounts through his contacts in the banking sector. I opened the message and read through the brief block of text. The words were plain, but their implications were catastrophic. Drummond confirmed that at exactly 4:00 that afternoon, Apex Developments had authorized the release of funds. A wire transfer of exactly $800,000 had successfully landed in the fraudulent bank account Preston had opened using my stolen Social Security number. I kept reading. The deposit was only the first half of the equation. The second half was the fatal blow. Drummond reported that the money didn't sit in that account for more than 45 minutes. The instant the funds cleared the banking holds, Preston executed a series of rapid, frantic wire transfers. He dispersed the $800,000 across 3 separate offshore accounts. Those accounts belonged to the shell companies run by the violent private lenders he owed his life to. Preston had drained the fraudulent account completely dry. The debts that had been threatening to break his legs were settled. The money was gone, vaporized into the untraceable void of the criminal underworld. I lowered the phone and looked back out through the wet windshield. Preston was ordering another round of drinks. He had absolutely no idea he had just sealed his own tomb. If he had left that $800,000 sitting in the account, there might have been a microscopic sliver of hope for his survival. If the money was still there, he might have had some room to negotiate when the trap finally sprang. Because in exactly 2 days, Apex Developments was going to send their demolition crew out to the lake. They were going to consult the official county plat maps. They were going to discover that the deed Preston had sold them did not correspond to a pristine lakefront estate. They were going to realize they had just paid $800,000 for a federally condemned, highly toxic swamp. When a corporation like Apex finds out it has been the victim of wire fraud, its first instinct is to demand an immediate and total refund. Had Preston kept the money, he could have wired it straight back. He would have still faced state and federal charges for forging my signature and committing identity theft. But he could have appeased the corporate predator. He could have stopped Apex from unleashing their fleet of ruthless litigation attorneys. But Preston didn't have the money. He had handed it all to ghosts. Apex Developments does not accept apologies. They do not accept payment plans. They have no interest in the sad stories of desperate men. When they demand their $800,000 back, and Preston tells them the account is completely empty, they will annihilate him. They will file an emergency civil suit for breach of contract and malicious fraud. They will financially evict him from his own life. What comes next is the moment everything my son set in motion finally lands, and the weight of it is something I still carry. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against you all along, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and let the truth do the work on its own timeline? They will seize his luxury apartment. They will repossess the cars. They will freeze every legitimate bank account he and Natasha share. They will strip him down to the bone to recover their lost capital. And that was only the civil penalty. The true nightmare waiting for my son was the federal government. By executing those frantic wire transfers, Preston had cemented his position as the primary guarantor of the sale. He had legally bound himself to the title of the toxic mill parcel adjacent tract, Lake Lanier, Georgia. He had legally assumed the $500,000 environmental cleanup lien mandated by the Environmental Protection Agency. He had paid off the private lenders who had been threatening to break his legs, but he had swapped them out for the federal government and a ruthless corporate giant, both of whom were about to descend on him at the same time. I watched the waiter bring a small tiramisu to their table. There was a single candle burning brightly on top. Natasha clapped her hands together in delight. Preston leaned over and blew out the flame. They were celebrating a total illusion. The heavy iron door of the trap had swung shut the instant those wire transfers cleared. The locking mechanism had engaged. The vault was sealed, and the oxygen was already draining away. They just hadn't realized they were suffocating yet. Watching them smile, I felt a strange and profound emptiness settle over me. There was no joy in any of this, only the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a ledger brought back into balance. A debt had been incurred against me, and now the payment had been collected. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, was gone for good. The man sitting in that restaurant was a parasite who had tried to feed on me. I had simply stepped aside and let him feed on himself instead. I felt no urge to roll down my window. I felt no pull to walk into that restaurant and face them. I had no desire to look them in the eye and tell them they had failed. A confrontation would only give them time to prepare. It would hand them a target for their rage. I preferred the silence. I preferred the complete and devastating shock that was coming for them Saturday morning. I slipped my phone back into my coat pocket. I reached down and turned the key. The engine of my truck came to life, a low, steady rumble that moved through the floorboards. I put the truck in gear and eased away from the curb. I folded back into the wet, crowded city streets, leaving the Rosewood Grill behind me. I drove away from the neon glow and the towers of glass, heading back toward the quiet isolation of the motel. Preston and Natasha were toasting to their future. I was going to let them have the last peaceful night they would ever know. The sun came up slowly over the dark water of the lake. I sat on the wooden steps of my back porch for what I understood would be the last time. A thick blanket of gray morning fog drifted across the surface of the water, wrapping itself around the reeds and the old wooden dock. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth, crushed pine needles, and the deep, rich smell of the forest stirring awake. I held a ceramic mug in both hands, letting the warmth of the black coffee seep into my stiff fingers. I watched a solitary osprey glide silently over the shallows, searching for a morning meal. It was a perfect still morning. Exactly the kind of morning my late wife Lorraine used to love more than anything else in the world. I remembered building this porch with my own hands 30 years ago. I remembered hauling the heavy oak beams through the front door, muscles burning, heart swollen because I was building a fortress for my family. I remembered painting the wooden window frames with Lorraine while our young son played in the green grass near the water's edge. I remembered the sweat, the laughter, and the love that had been pressed into every corner of this property. But as I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee, I did not feel sad. I did not feel the crushing, suffocating pull of nostalgia that a man is supposed to feel when he is losing his home. When betrayal cuts as deep as blood, it scorches away all the soft and tender emotions. It burns off the grief and leaves behind nothing but a cold, solid, absolute clarity. The beautiful house at my back was no longer a sanctuary. It was no longer a monument to a life of hard work. It was simply a stage set for the final act of a terrible play, a perfectly designed piece of bait. I finished my coffee. I stood, brushed the dust from my faded denim jeans, and waited for the invasion to begin. At exactly 9:00, the deep silence of the forest was shattered by the harsh mechanical roar of heavy diesel engines. The loud crunch of thick tires grinding against the long gravel driveway that ran from the main road down to the estate reached me before I saw anything. I didn't go out to meet them right away. I stayed on the porch listening as the machinery of my own eviction rolled onto my property. The first vehicle to break through the line of tall evergreen trees was a massive white commercial moving truck. It lumbered down the driveway, its heavy brakes squealing in protest. Close behind came a sleek black corporate SUV with deeply tinted windows. And trailing at the rear, following the corporate men like a loyal servant, was my son. Preston drove his least impressive luxury sedan right past the gravel parking area and straight onto the manicured grass of my front lawn. He parked with careless, breathtaking arrogance. The heavy tires crushed a bed of blue wildflowers Lorraine had planted with her own hands decades ago. The doors of the various vehicles swung open all at once. The sharp crack of slamming metal rang out through the quiet trees. A crew of 4 broad men in matching gray uniforms climbed out of the back of the moving truck. They looked bored, tired, and entirely indifferent to the destruction they had been hired to carry out. They were paid muscle there to haul away the physical remains of a man's entire life. 2 men in sharp, perfectly tailored suits stepped out of the black corporate vehicle. They wore the unmistakable predatory uniform of Apex Developments. Thick leather briefcases in hand, they moved with the arrogant ease of men who made their living dismantling homes and lives. Finally, Preston and Natasha stepped out of their car. Natasha had on large, dark designer sunglasses and a pristine, expensive white coat. She surveyed the property like a queen arriving to inspect newly conquered territory. She moved with a noticeable swagger, chin lifted high, basking in the power she believed she held. Preston wore a casual but incredibly expensive merino wool sweater. He walked with his hands buried deep in his pockets. He looked nervous. His eyes moved restlessly around the yard, scanning as if he expected me to step out from the tree line with a shotgun in my hands. He didn't know I was completely unarmed. He didn't understand that my weapons weren't made of steel or gunpowder. He had no idea my weapons were already buried deep inside the county land registries, sitting silently in the dark, waiting. I picked up my single worn canvas duffel bag. I slung the strap over my shoulder. I walked slowly around the side of the house and stepped out into the open front yard. Every person in that group stopped talking the moment they laid eyes on me. The moving crew shifted uneasily on their feet, reading the tension that hung thick in the air. The Apex representatives watched me with cold, calculating indifference. To them, I was nothing more than an administrative obstacle, an old man in the way of their construction schedule. Preston visibly flinched the moment my gaze found his. He actually stepped back half a pace, positioning himself slightly behind his wife. He was a man who could forge a signature in the dark, but couldn't hold his ground in the daylight. Natasha, however, stepped forward without hesitation. A wide, bright, thoroughly venomous smile spread across her face. She walked straight toward me, her expensive leather heels pressing into the soft dirt of my yard. She reached into her large designer purse and produced a cheap, folded black plastic trash bag. She extended it toward me with a look of pure, dripping condescension. She spoke in a loud, slow voice, the kind reserved for scolding a confused and disobedient child. She told me the moving crew was on a very tight and expensive schedule today. She said they only had time to load the valuable antique furniture and the high-end appliances earmarked for a private auction in Atlanta. She flicked her wrist impatiently, urging me to take the cheap garbage bag from her fingers. She told me I could use it to gather whatever worn clothes and personal junk I wanted to hold on to before the charity trucks came tomorrow, to haul the rest of my belongings off to the local landfill. She addressed me as though I were a diseased stranger blocking the entrance to her brand-new driveway. I looked down at the shiny black plastic bag swaying from her manicured fingers. I looked back up at the smug, radiant satisfaction glowing in her face. She wanted me to snatch it in a burst of blind fury. She wanted me to shout. She was desperate for me to curse her name, to break down, to hand her a solid reason, to turn to the moving crew and declare that the crazy, senile old man was becoming hostile and dangerous. She wanted a scene, something to justify the cruelty of what she was doing. I did not give her a single drop of the reaction she was hunting for. I did not frown. I did not raise my voice. I extended a steady hand and calmly accepted the plastic bag from her fingers. I folded it into a neat square and tucked it quietly into the front pocket of my jacket. I smiled at her. A soft, completely hollow smile. I told her thank you. I told her I appreciated the thought, but I had already taken care of everything that mattered to me. I watched her vicious smile waver for just a fraction of a second. The muscles along her jaw tightened. She was thrown off by my total compliance. She had braced herself for a screaming, bitter exchange. She had no framework for absolute silent surrender. I pulled my gaze away from her and fixed it on my son. Preston was staring hard at the expensive leather loafers on his feet. He would not look up. He refused to meet the eyes of the father who had worked 80 hours a week auditing corporate ledgers to pay for his prestigious college education. He could not look at the man who had spent entire nights rocking him through fevers and fear when he was small. He could not look at the man whose social security number he had stolen to fund the designer clothes currently on his back. He shifted his weight nervously from foot to foot. He began mumbling, his voice thin and unconvincing. He said this was for the best. He said I was simply no longer capable of maintaining a property this size. He said the state facility had a comfortable bed ready for me, and that I would be far happier surrounded by medical professionals who could manage my rapid cognitive decline. He recited the rehearsed lies he had polished in front of a mirror. He spoke them loudly enough for the corporate men nearby to hear, selling himself as the loving, burdened son, making a painful but necessary medical decision for a failing parent. He was playing the tragic victim. He was pretending the knife buried in my back was a scalpel put there to save me. I did not argue. I did not tell him I knew every detail of the massive gambling debts he had just wiped out with a stolen wire transfer. I did not mention the private investigators I had put on his trail. I did not bring up the encrypted bank statements currently locked inside my attorney's briefcase. I simply nodded. I told him he was probably right. I told him I was just a tired old man who needed to step aside and let the younger generation take the wheel. The men from Apex Developments moved forward at last, eager to close out the transaction. The lead representative, a tall man with slicked-back dark hair and a heavy gold watch on his wrist, didn't bother introducing himself to me. He didn't offer his hand. He dismissed my presence entirely. He turned straight to Preston and asked whether the premises were fully vacated. His tone was clipped and corporate. He said the demolition permits were already on file with the city planning office. He said the bulldozers were scheduled to arrive Tuesday morning, and they needed the lot cleared immediately to begin pouring the concrete foundation for the new luxury condominiums. Preston nodded eagerly, his face lighting up with a pitiful need to please the corporate predator. He very nearly bowed. He assured the representative that the house was completely empty and ready for the wrecking ball. I reached into the pocket of my faded jeans and pulled out a heavy metal ring holding a single badly rusted brass key. It was not the key to my lake house, Lake Lanier, Georgia. It was the key to the broken, rusted chain-link fence enclosing the federally condemned old mill parcel adjacent tract, Lake Lanier, Georgia, exactly 200 yards to the east. It was the physical key to the toxic radioactive swamp Preston had sold them on paper. I extended the ring toward my son. I told him this was the master key to the property. I told him it opened the primary access gate and that the demolition crews would need it to get onto the land. Preston snatched the rusted key from my palm with trembling, greedy fingers. He held it up in the morning light like a golden trophy. He flashed a wide, triumphant smile at the men from Apex. He told them the property was officially and legally theirs to demolish. He passed the rusted key directly to the lead representative. The tall man took it without a second glance, barely examined it, and dropped it into his suit pocket. I stood perfectly still and watched it happen. They were trading the precise instrument of their own mutual destruction, right there in front of me. Handshakes and smiles exchanged over a ticking federal time bomb. I looked at my house one final time. I took in the beautiful hand-laid stone chimney rising into the morning sky. I looked at the wide front windows catching the sun and the tall trees behind them. The moving crew had already started up the wooden porch steps, their heavy boots drumming against the planks. They carried metal dollies and thick quilted moving blankets. They were there to strip my home to its bones, to haul away the physical objects representing 30 years of living. But I knew the truth of it. Objects are nothing more than wood glass and woven cloth. They carry no real power. The true value of the estate, the clean, unencumbered legal title to the land itself, was sitting safely inside an irrevocable trust on file at Gerald Fitch's law firm downtown Gainesville, Georgia. The house they were ransacking was nothing but expertly placed bait, and the predators had just swallowed it whole. I shifted the canvas strap of my duffel bag on my shoulder. I turned my back on the house and started down the long gravel driveway toward my old truck waiting near the main road. I did not look back. I heard Natasha laughing behind me, a shrill, piercing sound of arrogant triumph ringing through the cold morning air. I heard Preston barking loud, confident orders at the moving crew, his voice swollen with the false authority of a man convinced he had just taken everything. They were celebrating their cruelty. They were reveling in what they believed was a magnificent total victory. They honestly thought they had successfully discarded a useless, senile old man. They thought they had locked in their financial future. They believed the $800,000 they had stolen was theirs to keep. I reached the truck and pulled open the heavy metal door. I tossed my bag onto the worn passenger seat. I climbed behind the wheel and pushed the key into the ignition. The old engine turned over with its familiar, reliable rumble. I rolled down the window and drew in a long, slow breath of fresh lake air. I did not shed a single tear. Not one microscopic trace of sorrow or regret moved through me. My heart held a steady, rhythmic, absolute calm. It was the deep peace that belongs to a man who understands that the mathematics of the universe are about to balance themselves completely, violently, and on schedule. My son had stolen my identity. He had forged my signature on legal documents. He had sold me out to settle his debts with dangerous men who might otherwise have taken his life. But he had not sold my house. He had sold a nightmare. By placing his name as the primary guarantor on that deed, he had legally strapped a $500,000 federal environmental cleanup obligation directly onto his own back. And he had unloaded that catastrophic liability onto a ruthless, unforgiving corporate machine that would grind his entire existence to dust the moment they realized they had been defrauded. They had 3 days, exactly 3 days to live inside their beautiful stolen illusion before the bulldozers arrived and the federal plat maps were laid bare. 3 days to drink expensive wine before the Environmental Protection Agency and the apex corporate lawyers descended on them like a pack of starving wolves. I shifted the truck into drive. I pressed my boot down on the gas. I rolled slowly away from the lake house, Lake Lanier, Georgia, leaving the arrogant parasites to feast on their poisoned prize. I headed toward the highway, bound for a quiet diner where I would drink hot coffee, eat a warm breakfast, and wait with a steady smile for the storm to finally break. 3 days passed since I handed my son that rusted key. Tuesday morning arrived, and the forest held its breath. The sky was pale and clear blue, the kind of sky that offers no mercy whatsoever. The deep quiet of the lake was suddenly and violently swallowed by the roar of industrial diesel engines. Apex Developments didn't waste a single moment. They had put together a small army of destruction. Massive yellow bulldozers and heavy tracked excavators ground down the main access road, their metal treads chewing through soft dirt and mashing the wild grass into thick mud. Flatbed trucks hauling steel dumpsters rumbled in behind them, their heavy suspensions groaning under the load. The air, usually clean with pine and cool water, was instantly fouled by the thick, acrid bite of exhaust fumes. They hadn't come to renovate. They had come to obliterate my sanctuary. I had parked my truck out of sight on the ridge above the estate, watching the scene below before making my final move. Preston and Natasha had shown up early. They were treating the demolition of my home like a red carpet premiere. It was a nauseating display of unearned triumph. Preston stood near the edge of the driveway in a crisp designer suit jacket over a dark turtleneck, a steaming cup of artisan coffee in hand, waving his arms and pointing at the property lines as if he'd built the entire world himself. Natasha was a perfect caricature of new money. Immaculate white trousers, oversized designer sunglasses, completely wrong for an active construction site. She was holding her phone up high on a rose-gold selfie stick, spinning in slow circles to capture videos for her social media followers. She posed in front of the massive yellow bulldozers, tossing her hair back, beaming a bright and thoroughly artificial smile. She was broadcasting her victory to anyone who would watch, proof that she had finally secured the luxurious future she believed she deserved. They were drunk on their own perceived brilliance. They thought the heavy machinery tearing up the lawn was the glorious sound of their ultimate success. They had no idea they were taking beautiful photographs of their own execution. I checked the silver watch on my wrist. It was exactly 10 hours in the morning. I turned the key in the ignition. I did not drive down that hill alone. Over the previous 3 days, I had assembled the most devastating coalition of legal and federal authority this county had ever seen. As my truck crept down the gravel road, 3 other vehicles pulled into tight formation behind me. Directly on my bumper was the sleek silver sedan of my attorney, Gerald Fitch. Behind him, the red and blue light bar of the county sheriff's marked patrol cruiser flashed silently from the roof. And at the rear, a heavy unmarked black SUV with dark tinted windows and federal government license plates. We moved down the driveway like a slow and deliberate wave. We hadn't come to negotiate. We had come to initiate a total legal quarantine. The Apex Development's foreman spotted the flashing lights of the sheriff's cruiser first. He threw up a hand and blew a sharp, piercing whistle. The massive diesel engines throttled down to a low, rumbling idle. The sudden quiet that dropped over the property was thick and dense with confusion. Preston stopped waving his arms. He turned around, his arrogant smile locking in place as he watched my old truck park squarely across the mouth of the driveway, physically blocking the machinery from moving another inch. Natasha lowered her phone, brow creasing with genuine irritation. She assumed I had come crawling back to beg for some piece of antique furniture. She figured I was just a pitiful old man returning to weep over a pile of boards. I stepped out of my truck. I did not look angry. I moved with the slow, unhurried pace of a man holding every card in the deck. Gerald Fitch climbed out of his car, gripping a thick, heavy leather briefcase. The county sheriff, a man I had known for 20 years, stepped out of his cruiser and rested his hand casually near his radio. Then the doors of the black federal vehicle swung open. 2 men in tactical windbreakers stepped onto the gravel. Emblazoned across the back of their jackets in bright yellow letters were the initials EPA. The Environmental Protection Agency had come to collect their debt. Preston moved toward me, his face flushing with a fast-rising mixture of embarrassment and anger. He glanced at the sheriff, then back at me, working hard to hold himself together as the wealthy landowner in front of his corporate demolition crew. He demanded to know what I was doing back on his property. He used a loud, commanding voice, ordering me to move my truck immediately because I was obstructing a multi-million-dollar development project. He told me I was making a fool of myself and had no legal standing to be standing on that dirt. Natasha fell in right behind him, arms crossed, demanding that the sheriff arrest me for trespassing. I held my ground. I did not raise my voice. I looked past my son and made direct eye contact with the Apex site manager, who was bearing down on us with a furious scowl, a rolled-up blueprint clutched in his fist. He announced he had firm orders to clear the lot by sunset and would be calling his corporate lawyers if we didn't get out of the road. I pointed a calm finger at the ground beneath our feet. I told the site manager he was free to call whoever he liked, but if a single bulldozer blade touched one blade of grass on this particular parcel of land, he and his entire crew would be looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary. Preston let out a loud, dismissive laugh. He told the site manager to disregard me entirely, claiming my mind was completely gone and that I was suffering from severe cognitive delusions. He jabbed a finger in my direction and announced to the whole crowd that he held the certified deed to the estate, that the sale was completely legal, and that I was nothing more than a confused and hostile trespasser. Gerald Fitch stepped forward. He did not smile. He snapped open his heavy leather briefcase and produced a stack of large rolled documents. He spread them flat across the hood of my truck for everyone present to examine. He told Preston to take a very careful look. These were not outdated deeds. They were freshly certified, legally binding county plat maps. Gerald pressed a firm finger against the bold red lines marking the property boundaries. He spoke with the cold precision of a seasoned attorney. He informed the Apex site manager that the land he was currently standing on was protected under an irrevocable family trust. He told the corporate representative that the deed my son had sold them did not correspond to this pristine lakefront estate. The site manager frowned and leaned his heavy frame across the hood to study the map. Preston moved closer, his arrogant smile beginning to fracture as his eyes worked across the mathematical coordinates and the shifted parcel identification numbers. He could see his own forged signature at the bottom of the transaction record, but the geographic markers tied to that signature were entirely wrong. I looked directly into my son's eyes. I watched the precise moment his mind tried to absorb the impossibility of what the paperwork was telling him. I told him he had done a beautiful job forging my signature. I said he had pulled off a sharp financial scam, stolen my identity, and sold my property with skill. But I explained that he had made one fatal error: he had never bothered to audit the product he was actually selling. I pointed toward the dense line of trees 200 yards to the east. I told Preston that the physical property he had legally sold to Apex Developments was the old mill parcel adjacent tract, Lake Lanier, Georgia. I spoke slowly, letting every word land with the crushing weight of an anvil. I told him he had just sold a ruthless corporation a federally condemned swamp. The blood drained completely from Preston's face. His skin turned a sickening shade of pale gray. He looked back down at the map hands beginning to shake violently as he traced the coordinates with a trembling finger. Natasha pushed forward, her voice climbing into a shrill, panicked squeak. She demanded to know what was happening and why the maps looked different. The reality hit her: the massive sum they had handed over to violent criminals was permanently tied to a worthless piece of poisoned ground. The Apex site manager went completely rigid. He snatched the plat maps from the hood of the truck eyes, sweeping the federal hazard warnings stamped boldly across the mill parcel coordinates. He understood that his corporation had just wired $800,000 for land that could not be legally developed, touched, or even walked on without serious federal clearance. He turned his head slowly and fixed my son with a stare so loaded with corporate malice it could have frozen boiling water. Preston backed away from the truck. He looked at me, eyes wide and utterly terrified. He was finally looking at the man who had spent 3 decades tracking down fraudulent operators just like him. He understood that I had never been the helpless victim. I had simply built the maze, swung the heavy door open, and waited patiently while he walked inside and locked himself in the dark. The air over the property had shifted entirely. It was no longer the clean, crisp air of a sanctuary. It was thick and charged, humming with the volatile energy of a high-stakes standoff. The bulldozers idled heavily, their diesel fumes hanging low in the gray morning fog. The Apex site manager, a man built like a concrete pillar, marched toward the front of my truck. His face was flushed red with fury, and he jabbed a thick, accusatory finger directly at my chest. He demanded I move myself and my vehicle off the premises immediately. He shouted that he had a rigid demolition schedule, corporate deadlines, and a signed deed granting him the absolute legal right to clear every tree and stone on this land. He spoke with the blind, arrogant certainty of a man who believed paperwork was an impenetrable shield. The sheriff, standing a few feet away, didn't concern him, and neither did the quiet old man by the truck. He was a machine built to execute orders, and I was blocking his path. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to meet his. I turned slowly toward Gerald Fitch. My attorney understood exactly the timing this moment called for. Gerald opened his heavy leather briefcase and produced a thick, rolled cylinder of documents. He did not hand them to the site manager. He unrolled them deliberately across the hood of my truck and smoothed the edges flat with both palms. I held the manager's gaze and told him his bulldozers were sitting on the wrong property. The site manager barked out a harsh, dismissive laugh. He glanced at Preston, standing nearby, pale and shaking. He yelled that he had the county records, the signed deed transfer, and the GPS coordinates supplied by the seller. He insisted his legal department had cleared the transaction and that the $800,000 wire proved their ownership beyond any question. He brought his heavy hand down hard on the hood of my truck and demanded we stop wasting his time. I gestured calmly toward the unrolled documents. I told the manager to study the official updated county plat maps very closely. I explained that what sat in his corporate office was a forged illusion. What was spread across the hood of my truck was the certified reality of the land registries. I directed a steady finger at the bold red lines defining the boundaries of my estate. I walked him through the specific parcel identification numbers assigned to the pristine lakefront property, and I showed him the trust, holding the title a trust completely insulated from the fraudulent power of attorney my son had manufactured. The site manager's confident sneer began to crack. He bent over the map's eyes, darting frantically across the complex mathematical coordinates and the shifted property boundaries. He was a builder, not an auditor, but he spoke the language of land. He saw the undeniable gap between the documents he had relied upon and the certified county records laid out in front of him. The parcel identification numbers did not align. The legal descriptions did not match the ground under his boots. I didn't let him sit with the confusion. I delivered the fatal blow with the cold, measured precision of a surgeon. I told him that my son, the man sweating and shivering a few feet away, had indeed sold a piece of property to Apex Developments. But I made clear that the property Preston had legally bound himself to deliver was not this house. It was not this valuable, pristine lakefront estate. I pointed toward the dense line of trees 200 yards to the east. I told the manager that the land Preston had officially transferred to his corporation was the abandoned mill parcel adjacent tract, Lake Lanier, Georgia. The name hit the site manager like a physical blow. The mill parcel carried a notorious reputation in local commercial real estate circles. It was not simply an empty lot. It was a dead zone. I explained in a voice stripped of all emotion that the land he had just acquired was legally condemned a toxic hazard, saturated with decades of industrial chemical runoff. I told him the soil was poisoned, the water table was contaminated, and the entire tract sat under strict federal quarantine. The realization moved across the site manager's face, like a wave draining the color out of it. His aggressive posture folded. He grabbed the plat maps, gripping the thick paper as he traced the coordinates of the mill parcel. He found the federal hazard warnings stamped across the registry. He saw the absolute, undeniable truth. He realized that his powerful, ruthless corporation, known for bullying sellers and rushing escrow, had just bypassed critical environmental due diligence. They had blindly trusted fraudulent paperwork handed to them by a desperate man. The Apex manager understood with sickening clarity that his company had wired $800,000 for a radioactive swamp. Preston let out a strangled, pathetic sound. He stepped toward the truck, hands raised in a hollow gesture of denial. He stammered that it was a mistake, a clerical error, a simple misunderstanding that could be sorted out with a few signatures. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, begging me to step in to stop the nightmare he had set in motion. He genuinely believed I could wave a hand and unwind the legal snare I had spent a month assembling. He still imagined I was as a simple carpenter, a naive old man who would pull him back from the edge of his own devastating choices. I looked at my son, the man who had stolen my identity, who had planned to dump me in a state-run facility to settle his gambling debts, who had laughed with his wife about packing my life into trash bags. I looked at him and felt nothing. No anger, no grief, only the empty, balanced silence of a completed audit. I told Preston there were no clerical errors. I told him the coordinates were exact, the paperwork was flawless, and the transaction was legally binding in every respect. I told him he had forged a master key to his own destruction. By placing himself as the primary seller and guarantor of the toxic title, he had delivered precisely what he had promised on paper, the mill parcel. He had executed the perfect scam, only to find that the prize he had stolen was a lethal liability. Natasha, standing nearby in her expensive white coat, let out a sharp, hysterical scream. The facade of the triumphant, wealthy couple shattered completely. She dropped her designer sunglasses and lunged toward Preston, seizing his arm, demanding to know what he had done. She screamed that they had already spent the money, that the $800,000 was gone, wired to violent private lenders to keep him alive. She cried that they had nothing left, no leverage, no safety net, and now no property. Her voice tore across the lawn, a raw, jagged sound, cutting right through the low idle of the bulldozers. The Apex site manager turned slowly away from the plat maps. He fixed Preston with a look so dark and saturated with corporate malice that it seemed to cool the air around them. He did not shout. He did not reach for physical threats. The men who operate for Apex developers have no need to raise their voices. He drew his phone from his pocket and announced with a terrifying calm that he was calling his legal department. He told Preston that by nightfall, Apex would freeze every single bank account bearing his name. Preston's luxury apartment, Buckhead, Atlanta, his leased vehicles, Natasha's belongings, all of it would be seized, the man promised. Emergency civil suits for wire fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of contract would follow. Apex, he made clear, would not rest until my son had nothing left. Preston reeled back, a half-step, air coming in shallow, panicked bursts. Every fiction of wealth he had constructed was dissolving right in front of him, caving into a pit of corporate liability with no visible bottom. His gaze found mine. Tears were gathering at the edges of his eyes, begging where his voice could not. How could I do this to my own child, he wanted to know. What kind of father watches his son get ground to dust and does nothing? I kept my voice level. What I gave him in return was the cold, unflinching truth. I had not done this to him. I had moved aside and let it happen. Every piece of the snare had been his own work. The signature on that deed, his hand. The corporate predator circling the property his invitation. He had walked straight into the jaws and called it opportunity. I told him he had sold my land, and the land was what he had left. The Apex site manager had already handed down the death sentence, but the full weight of what was coming hadn't even touched ground yet. Two men emerged from behind an unmarked vehicle, dark windbreakers, federal agency initials bold across their backs. Their energy was nothing like the construction manager's hot, explosive fury. What they carried instead was something far worse, the glacial, immovable certainty of the federal government in motion. Each boot fall on the gravel came down with a measured, deliberate rhythm, a clock counting down to something inevitable. The taller agent reached into his jacket and produced a thick sheaf of papers clamped together with a heavy metal binder. He walked toward my son. Preston was already trembling, his breathing shallow, and broken eyes cutting frantically toward the tree line, as though some gap in the tree line might offer a way out that didn't exist. The agent planted himself directly before Preston and extended the documents. His voice was flat and administrative, carrying across the still morning, without effort, audible even beneath the low rumble of the bulldozers sitting idle nearby. He informed my son that what he now held was an official federal citation, combined with a mandatory compliance order issued by the Environmental Protection Agency. The federal government, he continued, had kept a close eye on the ownership transfer of that condemned mill parcel, precisely because of its hazardous designation. Environmental law at the federal level, the agent explained, cares nothing for what a person intended. It is merciless about who holds liability. And by signing his name as primary guarantor on the transfer deed to pull through the immediate wire transfer from Apex, Preston had put himself on record as the sole title holder of that toxic ground at the exact instant the deal closed. The agent set the weighty stack of papers into my son's shaking hands. In accepting and executing that transfer, he told Preston full and permanent legal responsibility for the $500,000 environmental cleanup lien had passed to him. This was not a penalty subject to negotiation, the agent clarified. It could not be walked back in bankruptcy court. It was a federal mandate with teeth. Every account bearing his name would be frozen. Every paycheck would be garnished. Every asset attached to his Social Security number would be taken. And none of it would stop until the contaminated soil was clean. My son looked at those papers the way a man looks at a grenade with the pin already out. He was doing the math of his own ruin, and the numbers weren't adding up to anything survivable. He had handed over $800,000 to keep violent creditors quiet, wiping his accounts bare in the process. Now $500,000 more was owed to the United States government, and the men sent to begin collecting were standing 10 feet away on the lawn he thought was his. The stillness that came after the agent finished speaking lasted perhaps 3 seconds before it was torn apart by a sound sharp and vicious enough to make the moving crew startle where they stood. Natasha went rigid for just a moment as the magnitude of that federal debt registered. That spotless white designer coat of hers suddenly read as absurd the costume of a woman who had bet everything on a hand that had just busted. The gilded future she had architected across months of scheming, a future built from the wreckage of my eviction and my ruin, went up like paper. She did not go to her husband. Not a single word of comfort, loyalty, or even basic human solidarity crossed her lips. What she did instead was wheel on Preston with the raw, frantic rage of something cornered, all pretense gone. She crossed to him in 3 strides and drove both palms hard into his chest. She screamed that he was an unqualified, irredeemable failure. She had been promised a life of wealth and a clean windfall. Instead, he had chained her to a poison field and a federal debt she'd spend her lifetime never escaping. She moved in tight, furious circles across the flattened wildflowers, both hands raking through her carefully arranged hair. She let the whole yard hear it. She would not be burying herself under his catastrophic mistakes for the next 30 years. Their entire marriage, she announced, was a fabrication constructed on false wealth, concealed debt, and nothing real underneath. And there was no version of this where she allowed a government agency to strip her own assets dry to remediate his radioactive disaster. Every trace of the warm, devoted daughter-in-law she had performed for years peeled away at once, leaving something hollowed out and predatory in its place. She stared at Preston with a contempt so naked, it finished whatever was left of his dignity right there in front of the agents and the apex executives. The site manager watched Natasha dismantle my son and felt nothing resembling pity for her. He had a call going to Apex's corporate legal team back in the Buckhead Financial District in Atlanta, and he was absorbing instructions fast. When he pulled the phone from his ear, the expression that settled on his face was surgical and without warmth. He moved toward Preston, cutting straight through Natasha's screaming as if it were background noise. Apex was closing the channel any further conversation would happen before a federal judge, he told my son. A lawsuit was being filed immediately: wire fraud, intentional misrepresentation, contract breach, the full ledger. Emergency motions were already moving through the courts to lock down Preston's luxury apartment, Buckhead, Atlanta, every bank account, every leased vehicle. His corporation, the manager said, without blinking, had resources that did not run dry, and they would stay in litigation for 10 years, if that's what it took, to reduce Preston to nothing. Every dollar of the stolen $800,000 would come back to Apex, he promised. Plus damages, plus the cost of every delayed construction day, plus whatever the lawyers billed. The predator Preston had welcomed through my front door had completed its turn and now had its full weight pointed at him. He was caught between two forces closing from opposite sides, Apex on one flank, the federal government on the other, and there was nowhere left to move. His legs went. Preston dropped straight down onto the wet grass, knees driving into the mud churned up beneath his own car. That expensive merino wool sweater hit the earth and came up dark with it. The federal documents spilled out of his grip and scattered pages lifting in the breeze and wrapping around his legs. He had nothing left. 3 days ago, this man had called me in cold blood to inform me I was being put out of my own home. That version of him no longer existed. What sat in the mud now was a frightened, weeping boy who had just come to understand that the thing he was most afraid of was real, and it had already arrived. He raised his face from the ground. Tears ran freely down his cheeks, cutting through the sweat, and one trembling hand reached out to me. He begged. He wanted me to put my auditor's knowledge to work, he said. Untangle the filings, correct the boundary records, make this go away. Federal prison, he sobbed. The violent private lenders, once they learned he was finished, would come for what remained. His wife was gone, his freedom was gone, his future had collapsed in the span of a few minutes. He begged me to sign the clean title of the lake house, Lake Lanier, Georgia, back over to him. He begged me to drain my life savings to settle the federal environmental lien, to rescue him the way I had always rescued him from every mess he made growing up. He broke down completely, reminding me through his sobs that he was my only son, that a father couldn't simply hand his own child over to destruction when that child was on his knees begging. I stood without moving, watching him fall apart among the wildflowers Lorraine had put in the ground herself. The familiar weight of her wedding ring sat against my chest in my breast pocket, a quiet comfort. My eyes moved to the moving trucks blocking my driveway, the same machines he had deliberately arranged to throw me out of my own home like something disposable. Then to the bulldozers, those massive yellow things he had cheerfully ordered in to demolish everything I had built here with my own 2 hands. I thought about the ice in his voice when he called me a freeloader. I thought about how his face had shown nothing, not a flicker of guilt, when he'd used my social security number to prop up his hollow performance of wealth. I did not reach down. I did not extend a hand or a word of comfort, or the first syllable of forgiveness. The relationship between father and son had ceased to exist. What remained was an auditor standing over a closed ledger. The fraud had been committed, the liability had been established, and the reckoning had landed exactly where it was supposed to. I looked down at the figure weeping in the mud beneath me and delivered my verdict in the quiet, final tone of a man whose work is done. I told him he had sold my property. I told him to enjoy the dirt. A full month had come and gone since the bulldozers went quiet and rolled back out of my life. The morning carried that familiar bite of cool air, thick with pine, and the smell of the lake. I was sitting at the far end of the old wooden dock legs, hanging loose above the dark water, a fishing rod resting easy in my grip. The lake lay flat as glass below me, giving back a clean image of pale sky and dense tree line. No noise, no one announcing my eviction, no trucks idling in the drive waiting to cart off 30 years of memory. The house rose solid and unchanged at my back. It had come through everything without so much as a scratch, a fortress that had held. I watched the rod tip dip once gently, where something small was making up its mind about the bait. I let it be. I watched the tiny rings move outward across the still surface and disappear. There was no urgency pulling at me. The morning was mine and there was plenty of it. That suffocating weight I had carried for so long was gone. What had replaced it was something wide and settled, a piece with real foundation. Then the gravel in the driveway shifted under slow-moving tires. I kept my eyes on the water. I recognized the engine. Gerald Fitch's silver sedan rolled quietly into the yard. Moments after that, the dock boards gave their familiar complaint under approaching footsteps. Gerald came to the end of the dock and stood at my side, both of us looking out across the broad stretch of open water. He had left the courtroom clothes back at Gerald Fitch's law firm downtown Gainesville, Georgia. Today it was a plain gray sweater and dark trousers. He didn't say anything right away. We let the silence sit between us, watching the mist lift off the water as the sun climbed. Men who have spent careers in the hard machinery of corporate law know what it's worth to say nothing for a while. After several minutes, Gerald reached into his coat and brought out a few folded pages. He exhaled slowly, breath going white in the cool air. He told me the final dominoes had officially fallen. He told me the machinery of justice had executed its work with flawless precision. He started with the corporate side of things. Apex Developments had met the news of the fraud with a ferocity that left even veteran legal observers in the Buckhead Financial District in Atlanta unsettled. The executives had been made to look foolish by a desperate amateur, and they turned their full litigation apparatus loose on my son. Gerald explained that an emergency hearing had given Apex immediate authority to freeze every financial account tied to Preston's name. The accounts he used to dress himself in designer labels locked solid. The joint savings were emptied by court order. Preston's luxury apartment, Buckhead, Atlanta, was seized, and the building management changed the locks on him overnight. The cars were tracked down by recovery agents and taken from wherever he had left them. Within days, Preston had been reduced to nothing, not enough liquid money to buy a meal, let alone retain a lawyer to stand against a corporation with unlimited litigation resources. Apex had efficiently erased every trace of the wealth he had worked so hard to project. But the civil hammer was only part of what was falling on him. Gerald unfolded his papers and read through the federal side of the ledger. The Environmental Protection Agency had not issued a warning and moved on. They had handed the entire file directly to federal prosecutors. Preston had executed his fraudulent wire transfers through the federal banking system, and the forged documents had carried his scheme across state financial lines, both facts dragging the case squarely into federal jurisdiction. A grand jury had come back with a multi-count indictment. He was looking at decades inside a federal penitentiary, charged with wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal forgery of legal instruments. And the $500,000 environmental cleanup lien Gerald told me was permanently welded to his name. No court would ever cut him loose from that obligation. It would be there inside the prison system with him, and it would be there if he ever stepped back out. The trap he had so eagerly sprung on himself had sealed shut from every direction. No seam, no give, no exit. I wound the fishing line back in, checked the bait, and sent it out again into the deep. Then I asked Gerald about Natasha, the woman who had pressed a black garbage bag into my hands and laughed while I was being pushed out of my own home. Gerald gave a slow, cold smile at that. He told me parasites follow a predictable pattern. The instant Natasha understood the money had evaporated and that federal indictments were being drafted, she cut every cord connecting her to Preston. No loyalty. No solidarity with the man she had conspired alongside. She filed for emergency divorce proceedings the following morning, racing to put legal distance between herself and the federal debt. Then she loaded her designer wardrobe into her expensive luggage and left the state, entirely abandoning Preston to face the corporate lawyers and the federal prosecutors without a single person in his corner. She ran. My son was left to stand alone in the wreckage of what they had built together. I took in the final accounting of his ruin and felt nothing resembling pity. No pull toward mercy or intervention. The books were even. They had engineered something meant to grind an old man into the ground, and that same machine had simply pivoted and consumed them both. I thanked Gerald for the care he had put into this. I told him he was a good friend. He gave a nod, laid a hand briefly on my shoulder, and made his way back along the dock to his car. The lake and the morning sun had me to themselves again. The air was clean. The water sat still. The property was safe. I settled back and let my eyes rest on the light moving across the surface of the water, carrying the quiet knowledge that the storm had run its course. Whatever poison had taken root in my life had been drawn out completely. What remained was silence, and the silence was good. The sun had already slipped behind the tree line by the time I went back inside. The living room held the last dim warmth of evening light. I settled into my favorite leather armchair, the one positioned near the stone fireplace that Lorraine and I had laid together. The house was perfectly still, no clock, no traffic, only the deep restorative quiet of a space that had been cleared of something toxic. When my phone buzzed against the oak coffee table, the sound was almost jarring in all that stillness. I looked at the screen. An unknown number, but I had no doubt where it was coming from. I picked the phone up and put it to my ear. An automated voice, flat and mechanical, told me I was receiving a collect call from a federal holding facility. It asked if I would accept the charges. I said yes, quietly. I wanted to hear the last sound of the storm I had set in motion. The line connected, and the dense echoing acoustics of a concrete room came through the unmistakable sound of a place with no softness in it. And then came the weeping. It was a wet, ragged, desperate sound. The sound of a man who had been stripped down to nothing, every arrogant illusion peeled away. He called me Dad, his voice fracturing and bouncing through the sterile federal phone line. He begged me not to hang up. It was Preston. Every trace of the cruel corporate swagger he had worn the day he tried to put me out of my own home was gone from his voice. He sounded small, frightened, hollowed out. He told me he had one phone call to make. He said he was in a holding cell surrounded by cold steel and men he didn't want to be near. He begged me to reach out to Gerald Fitch. He pleaded with me to use whatever savings I had, to post his federal bail. He swore on everything that he had learned that he was truly and deeply sorry, that he would spend whatever remained of his life making it right if I would just pull him out one last time. He reached for the word family. He reached for the word blood. He wept into the receiver, telling me that a father simply could not leave his own child to waste away in a federal cage. He was working the same levers he had worked successfully for 30 years, reaching for the deep parental guilt he knew was buried somewhere underneath everything I had done. He was counting on finding a soft and vulnerable father still alive under the cold mechanics of my legal trap, one who couldn't stomach watching his child suffer. I listened to every word. I did not interrupt him. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't feel a flicker of righteous anger or vindictive satisfaction. Gloating belongs to small men who still need something from their enemies. I needed nothing. What I felt instead was the clean, sterile calm of a completed audit. Every number reconciled. Every liability accounted for and closed. When his sobbing finally dissolved into ragged, shallow breathing, I spoke. My voice was level and quiet, but what it carried was an absolute chilling clarity. I told Preston he was confusing biology with loyalty. Sharing genetic material, I told him, is nothing more than an accident of nature. Blood alone does not make a family. Respect makes a family. Trust makes a family. Shared sacrifice and unwavering honesty between people, that is what builds a family. I told him that real family does not steal a father's identity to bankroll a fraudulent performance of wealth. Real family does not forge a signature to hand a man's sanctuary over to a corporate predator. Real family does not press a black garbage bag into an old man's hands and order him off his own land with a smug expression on its face. I let each word travel slowly down that telephone wire and settle into the concrete walls surrounding him. I told him that for his entire adult life, I had positioned myself as a financial cushion beneath him, always there to absorb whatever he broke. I told him that constant protection had done something corrosive to him. I had kept him insulated from the consequences of his own choices for so long that he had become something incapable of sustaining itself without feeding off the person nearest to him. I told him the cushion was gone. He had reduced it to ash the moment he decided my existence was a resource available for his disposal. Preston gasped, begging me to hear him out, begging for one last opportunity to show me he could be a worthy son. He cried that when he eventually came out of prison, he would have nothing at all. Federal fines, corporate lawsuits, he would be buried. I told him he was right about that. I told him I had one final piece of business to walk him through before I closed the ledger between us for good. I wanted him to understand the total and permanent weight of the decisions he had made. The lake house, Lake Lanier, Georgia, that valuable property he had worked so hard to take from me, was no longer mine to offer anyone. Gerald Fitch and I had spent the previous afternoon finalizing a new set of legal documents. Every asset I owned, every bank account, every investment, and the deed to the lake house, Lake Lanier, Georgia itself, had been moved into an irrevocable trust, properly executed and permanent. I let the silence sit before delivering the last sentence. I told him the sole beneficiary named in that trust was a charitable foundation devoted to protecting natural wildlife habitats. Upon my death, I told him the estate would become a public nature reserve. There was nothing left for him to inherit, not now, not ever. The vault held nothing. He had already taken his inheritance and spent every dollar of it on a toxic swamp. A hollow, airless silence came through from the federal holding cell. Preston didn't scream. He didn't cry. His mind had simply stopped moving under the weight of something total and inescapable. Whatever future he had still been imagining for himself had been completely erased. There were no remaining moves. The game had reached its end. I offered no farewell, no final words of fatherly wisdom. I drew the phone slowly away from my ear. Through the large living room window, the lake lay dark and still, throwing back the silver light of the moon from its surface. I pressed the button on the screen and ended the call. I set the phone down quietly on the wooden table. I stood and I walked away, leaving everything behind me for good. The last bruised colors of evening had been pulled below the tree line with the setting sun. Outside my window, the lake had become a smooth sheet of black glass, giving back the scattered light of the early stars. I rose from the leather armchair and moved through the quiet rooms of the house at an easy pace. The silence was deep, but it was no longer the suffocating, loaded silence of something about to break. This was the wide, restorative quiet of a field after the fighting has ended, after the smoke has lifted, and the ground has gone still. I moved into the hallway and let my fingers trail along the edge of the antique oak bookshelves. The very shelves my son had wanted to tear apart just days earlier. I ran my hand across the spine of a worn, leather-bound novel that had belonged to Lorraine. I lifted a small framed photograph from the mantel. It showed Lorraine and me standing out on the dock 30 years ago, our faces carrying that particular exhaustion that only comes from building something real. I understood in that moment that my son had never grasped what this house actually was. When he looked at the timber walls and the stone fireplace, he saw a sum to be liquidated and converted. Wealth is a deceptive and treacherous thing. When a person builds it through their own labor and sacrifice, it becomes something solid, a foundation that shelters the people around you. But handed to someone who has never bled to earn it, wealth curdles into something addictive and destructive. It works on a person's character from the inside, quietly rotting it through. I had wanted to give my son an easier life than mine. I had tried to absorb every hardship before it could reach him. I understood now that in doing so I had inadvertently denied him the exact adversity he needed to grow into a person of honor. I set the photograph carefully back on the mantel. There was no sorrow sitting in me, no residue of regret. A master carpenter understands a hard truth about what holds a structure together. When a load-bearing timber begins to rot, you cannot cover the damage with a coat of paint and trust it to keep the roof from falling. You have to bring a sharp saw to it and cut the decay out completely. Leave the rot in place, and it spreads until the whole structure comes down on top of you. I had finally brought the saw to my own family tree. I had cut out the rot to protect what the foundation was built for. I went into the kitchen and flipped on the small light over the counter. I filled the carafe with fresh water, measured the dark grounds into the filter, and the machine came to life, humming and bubbling, sending a rich, familiar smell through the cool night air. I poured the coffee into my favorite ceramic mug and carried it out to the back porch. I sat down in my favorite wooden porch chair and looked out into the solid dark of the trees. My home was at peace again. The air was clean. The ledger was closed. I was entirely alone. And for the first time in 30 years, I was completely free. Looking back across the ashes of that relationship, I came to understand something lasting about the true nature of unconditional love. We grow up hearing that family is a bond. Nothing can sever that a parent's duty is to keep absorbing the damage their children cause, endlessly, without limit. But a permanent safety net doesn't build resilience in anyone. It cultivates entitlement, pure and absolute. The real wisdom is understanding that when love becomes a tool for manipulation, stepping away is not abandonment, it is an act of necessary self-preservation. You cannot cure something that feeds on you by letting it feed harder. That phone call from the federal holding facility was the last conversation my son and I ever had. I set the phone down on the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the lake sitting quiet and still in the dark. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt like I could breathe. Looking back on all of it, the betrayal, the long months of careful preparation, The day it all came apart on that driveway, I won't pretend it didn't cost me something. It cost me the version of fatherhood I had always imagined. But I believe God does not allow a man to walk through that kind of fire without a reason. The Lord's timing has a way of burning away everything that was never truly yours to carry. What was left when the smoke cleared was the truth that I had spent 30 years confusing sacrifice with wisdom and protection with love. These are the things I know now that I wish I had understood far sooner. If someone uses your love as a lever to move you, that is not a relationship, it is a transaction. Walk away from it. Building a safety net for your children is an act of love. Never letting it drop is an act of harm. When loyalty is only extended to you in the moment someone needs something, it was never loyalty to begin with. The most important father stories are not the ones where a man saves his family. They are the ones where a man finally saves himself. Families can fracture, but family justice, the kind that is earned through patience, evidence, and an unshakable sense of what is right, that is available to every one of us. If this story reached something in you today, leave a comment below and tell me what it stirred up. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, a father, a friend, anyone carrying the weight of a betrayal they haven't yet found the courage to face, please pass it along to them. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Alpha Dad Stories so you don't miss what comes next, thank you for sitting with me through this one. It means more than I can say. I'll see you in the next story.